Welcome to the Aerospace Advantage podcast, brought to you by PenFed. I'm your host, Heather Lucky Penney. Here on the Aerospace Advantage, we speak with leaders in the DoD, industry, and other subject matter experts to explore the intersection of strategy, operational concepts, technology, and policy when it comes to air and space power. Folks, today we're bringing you a special edition of the Aerospace Advantage to discuss Saturday's strike on Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. Everyone's read the news by now. The story of the 7 B-2s flying from Whiteman Air Force Base, numerous aerial refuelings along the way, air superiority aircraft joining the raid, tomahawk missiles fired from a submarine, and significant support from space assets. But what we wanted to add to this conversation were the insights and key observations from our team members, each of whom brings unique operational expertise to the mix. We've heard enough from the talking heads. It's time for Airpower and spacepower practitioners to join the conversation. And I want to say this up front. Our airmen, guardians, and sailors, and everyone involved with this mission performed spectacularly. We're going to talk about some of the broader challenges, but make no mistake, we are so proud of these folks who engaged in this mission. They answer the call. Part of our discussion centers around ensuring that we back them up with the resources that they need for future fights. So with that, I'd like to welcome Lieutenant General Dave Deptula. Sir, great to have you back.
Hey, great to be here, Heather.
Mark Gonzo Gunzinger.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
Brigadier General Houston Cantwell.
Morning.
Slider, great to have you. Charles Galbraith.
Great to be here.
And for a Washington perspective, Doug Berkey.
Hey, pleasure.
So, General Deptula, you've been tracking Iran's nuclear program for years. Why is America's direct involvement in conducting airstrikes against Iran such a big deal?
Well, Heather, let's start with the big rocks. The president took the correct step in committing U.S. air power to critical, absolutely critical, but limited strikes against Iran. First, because it set back Iran's progress in acquiring nuclear weapons. Second, and a very important byproduct, is it was fundamental to restoring U.S. credibility on the world stage after years of perceived indecision and strategic uncertainty, created in part by the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, and then seeing the U.S. being deterred by Putin from giving Ukraine the weapons and the authorities to use them effectively, just to name two examples. Now, direct strikes reinforce U.S. credibility with allies and adversaries alike. Regional partners like Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates see this as a sign of American resolve, and then adversaries like Iran, Russia, and China take note that the U.S. is once again willing to act decisively to uphold its strategic red lines. Now, make no mistake, the Iran we've known for the last 45 years no longer exists as a result of the U.S. and Israeli air power actions. I think that the audience is familiar with, but I'll just remind them that Iran's followed a pretty linear path for those 45 years, seeking to expand its power by violently destabilizing the Middle East for decades. And multiple administrations from both parties, as well as foreign leaders, have tried to negotiate with Iran, but it's been a constant pattern of talk and take by Iran. You know, they opportunistically take advantage of negotiations only to advance their nuclear aims. And frankly, their violent track record's bad enough with conventional weapons. Imagine if they had nukes, and that would be intolerable. So consequently, that's why Israel and the United States decided enough. It's time to halt their progression toward a nuclear reign of terror.
Sir, thank you for that roll-up. Doug, what are some of the other big issues at play?
No, the boss hit the big rocks. I mean, fundamentally, after Afghanistan and Iraq, which those did not go well, I mean, just we all know the images from Kabul and all. It's very difficult for U.S. credibility. We've misplayed our hand constantly in Ukraine. Recently, it's gotten very weak. Putin is running the table on that. And look at Yemen. That operation was great. Got China being aggressive. There came a point where U.S. credibility is on the line, and we had to act in a decisive fashion. And if you look at the scale and scope of the threat that Iran has presented for so long, for Israel to roll in this hard, and if we didn't come in with the capabilities that only we possess to try to net this desired effect with the nuclear program, it would have been very, very disastrous for our allied confidence. And, I want to make a very, very clear point here. Only U.S. Air Force Airpower could do this. We talk about it all the time in the podcast and the importance of investing in the Air Force. The Navy couldn't do this. Our allies couldn't do this. Only the U.S. Air Force had the range, the payload, and the survivability to execute this mission, which is why we have to invest in those capabilities. And credit to all those aircrew, they did amazing things, but in reality, that was strung together with some pretty thin miracles because of how stretched thin in our forces right now. I mean, 19 B-2s. Yeah. I don't think we've ever seen that many B-2s in the air at one given time between the primary mission aircraft and the backup airframes because of how small the fleet is and readiness and all that. So there's just a lot on line. And to bring this back in a big picture, if Iran went nuclear, I would argue you'd probably see the rest of the Middle East go nuclear very fast. Saudi Arabia, and it would cascade from there. I don't think we could tolerate that. So for those that argue what happens if we did this, I'd ask what happens if we don't. And there's way more on the line that way.
And let's just be clear, diplomatic talks have failed over the past 20 years. It's not as if giving Iran more time or continuing to engage in nuclear conversation was going to achieve the desired effect. It was not going to stabilize the region and really disarm them as a nuclear aspirant. We had to take this unique moment in time.
Yep.
I'd like everyone else's thoughts.
Yeah, Gonzo here, real quick. I just want to stress it's important to acknowledge that we now have a president who follows through on his promises, a president who will reinforce red lines and not back away from them. As we all know, deterrence is a matter of the capability and the will to act, and the latter has been in deficit for far too long. That's no longer the case.
But I'm going to be honest, Gonzo, how he's acted with Ukraine and Putin, he had a hole to dig out of on credibility.
Fair point. But this does send a very strong message to both Russia and to China.
And also to our allies, right? I mean, because we've seen a lot of that credibility erode our allies' trust and our willingness to either be an umbrella for them in terms of security or to really strongly partner with them, especially when it comes to Russia as well as China, right? So our willingness to stand by Israel and execute this operation, which was core to our national security interests, as well as, I would argue, the Western world, was absolutely crucial.
So what struck me about this was the similarities to an operation back in 1986, El Dorado Canyon. So Libya was a sponsor of terrorism in the 80s. And President Reagan at the time decided it was time to strike Libya. And so it was an air campaign, a limited strike against specific targets. And it didn't result in the United States invading Libya or occupying Libya for decades, right? And so I think it's important to put this strike in historical context. And I think El Dorado Canyon is a much more relevant example than Iraq or Afghanistan in the past 20 years.
That's a really good point, because there's a lot of folks right now that are in hysterics thinking we're going to have to go invade Iran, that now we own the war, as opposed to thinking this is a limited strike. This has got limited objectives. We need to achieve those objectives and then be done.
But to be fair to the situation, it'll be interesting to see what the response is.
That's true. The enemy always gets a vote.
Because there's no telling what branch plan we're going to go down after that.
Absolutely.
So, Gonzo, in addition to your time as a bomber pilot, you've held senior positions in the Pentagon and on the National Security Council. So, build on this. Talk to us about these sorts of decisions, how they're made, and what it's like to be inside those meetings.
Yeah, 3 quick points. OPSEC. It's paramount. So those meetings are restricted to the very few who really need to know. Those who are critical to planning the missions such as this one. So within DoD, the SecDef, DepSecDef, Joint Chiefs, of course, and in the Air Force, the top 4 plus the A3, and possibly some planners in checkmate. So undoubtedly, the president asked the SecDef for options, and several were offered, along with a recommendation for the option that would have the highest probability of success. And by that, I mean the ability to create desired effects on designated targets with an acceptable level of risk. And that's why the Air Force actually acquired B-2s, as Doug said, and will soon field the B-21 radar stealthy bomber, because no other aircraft in the world can deliver our largest penetrating conventional weapons with great precision and do so with a very low probability of being detected and tracked by an adversary.
Well, I think this is key, what you mentioned about the B-2. There are only 3 nations in the world that hold bombers, right? It's us, Russia, and China. And the whole point of that bomber fleet is to be able to do strategic strike by denying the adversary sanctuary. That's the whole core of what those aircraft are intended to do.
Now, put it more directly, the entire free world depends on 19 B-2s with range, payload, survivability. That is not acceptable. We need more.
So, John Deptula, you participated in the earliest stages of conceptualization, design, and convincing the Pentagon leadership of the rationale that ultimately became the Desert Storm air campaign. What would you add?
Well, Heather, we'd need several hours to adequately do that. Let me offer that every military option to use force or construct a more complex use of air power for an entire military campaign is going to be different. So the circumstances change. There's not just a single template. In the case of Desert Storm, the CENTCOM commander was not happy with the options that his staff presented him. So he called the Air Force Chief of Staff to ask for help. And that gave the small group of Air Staff planners that were already thinking about the problem the authority to proceed with a non-traditional plan that optimizes the use of air power in the design of the entire Desert Storm campaign. Mm-hmm. But that required selling the plan to both the Air Staff, the Air Staff and other people in the Air Force, believe it or not, the Joint Staff, and the Office of the Secretary of Defense leadership before then getting that plan in front of the president. Now, we had an advantage because we had an inside person on the National Security Council staff. And in the interest of time, I'll cut to the chase. Our small planning group built the objectives of the campaign and got our contact to feed them to the president, who then adopted them as his own in providing direction to the combatant command as his objectives. So that made it a lot easier from our perspective because we already knew what we wanted to do. Those became the objectives and then were fed back to us. So that's how you make things happen to your advantage in Washington.
Well, there's a key point here, sir. You guys came up with a strategy that was effects-based, and occupation and attrition warfare is a choice. And that is bad strategy, and those are bad decisions that normally don't work out well for us. And we have some pretty big choices right now about not getting sucked down that rat hole. And so far, we haven't, but it's very important to understand we don't have to end up with 20-year occupations.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that attrition and occupational warfare, that did not go well for us.
And it wasn't effects-based for what we really wanted.
Absolutely. And to go back to your earlier point, Doug, if you don't have the capabilities you need, the entire free world rests on 19 B-2s, then the National Command Authority, the president, does not have options. And so that's why it's absolutely crucial that we maintain those B-2s within the inventory because they provide opportunities and options that no other aircraft within the U.S. fleet or our allies' fleets provide us. Yeah. And that's core.
Yeah, I'd also add, don't forget, you're right, Doug, but don't forget, in 1991, that was not the decision, all right? It wasn't until 10 years later that the decision was made to use large numbers of forces in an occupation perspective. And part of that was driven by, the reality is it was driven by an army that was seeking relevance. And that's part of the reason we went down this wrong path.
No, I'm agreeing with you. I'm just contrasting what you did in Desert Storm with what happened 10 years later.
Yeah, because Desert Storm, you collapsed the entire Iraqi military. You didn't need to have that kind of occupation as well as the massive forces and attrition campaign.
That's why we need a couple hours to talk about this, because the point was made, let's finish this now. But the leadership at the time said, no, we accomplished our objectives of ejecting Iraq from Kuwait. We're done. We're out of here.
Okay, so back to the topic at hand. President Trump makes the decision to launch. Joan Deptula, talk to us about how the involved forces are generated. Because crews don't just climb into airplanes and launch. There's a serious enterprise behind all of this at work. So can you walk us through that process?
First, Heather, as you know, and everyone here, but for our audience, there's a big difference between planning a single strike and planning an entire air campaign. But there are also similarities. In both cases, planning starts with the desired outcomes. In other words, what are the objectives of the operation? Because the answers will define then what has to be accomplished, and that will drive elements specific to the number and type of aircraft and weapons involved. Fundamental to all of this is intelligence. In this case, intelligence is developed over many years on the two B-2 targets that were hit in this case, Furto and Natanz. But intel's also critical to the tactics involved with the attack approach. How can exposure to the air defense threats be minimized? Where are the acquisition radars? Does Iran have any functional interceptor capability left? What's the status of these defenses relative to the previous 9 days of Israeli Air Force attacks? So the answers to these questions drove the fighter escort requirements and tactics to assure appropriate air superiority conditions were established to minimize the risk to the B-2s and increase the probability of mission success. So combining the mission objectives with the intelligence about the targets, threat arrays, and their locations drove the suppression of enemy air defense plan, which included electronic warfare support, as well as all the associated details. Now, similarly, the communications methodologies need to be identified to assure effective command and control. And then there's the issue of coordination with partners and allies to include overflight of other countries, and of course, the diplomatic notifications involved or not, meaning the question of balancing surprise and security with diplomacy. This also included coordination with the Israeli Air Force, and what we saw is they cleared out of Iran completely during the time that the U.S. was in. So there's a lot that goes into a plan like this, even though it was only about 125 aircraft versus the nearly 3,000 of the opening 24 hours of Desert Storm.
Well, and I think this was a really unique moment in time because in order to be able to execute that, the Israeli Air Force opened up that opportunity by attacking the air defenses, by attacking their combat aircraft, and really creating an environment and an opening that allowed us to be able to go in with that kind of limited strike.
Yeah, can there be a better advertisement for F-35?
Yeah.
I mean, for all the naysayers about that jet, there is no clear picture about why it's crucial in today's environment.
Yeah, and their effectiveness against advanced missile threats, against that air defense, against the aircraft, their ability to layer effects because they're not just fighters, it's not just strike, it's also electronic warfare and intelligence. So everything the F-35 brings to the table is really crucial to empowering and enabling this operation.
Let me just jump in there, Heather, because it ain't just the I just want to put an exclamation point behind what you and Doug said. The Israelis would not have achieved the degree of success as they had without the F-35. And the piece that we're talking about here is the inherent stealth or low observability features with the F-35 in conjunction with its information sensor suites. But don't forget, what's an inherent characteristic that enabled the U.S. to succeed in this event? Well, it was the inherent stealth and low observability of the B-2. So for those naysayers out there that think stealth is dead, think again. We just saw a visible demonstration of its value, and low observability is an entry-level prerequisite to any future advanced aircraft, period, dot.
I think that's really key because if you aren't stealthy, you make the problem set so much easier for the adversary. There might be emerging phenomenologies like IR and EO that can create additional threats for the aircraft, but RF is the most lethal element of the kill chain because of the fidelity that gives you for your weapon systems. So it remains that foundation of being able to go into bad guy land.
No, and those pieces you're bringing about, they're additive. You don't give up on the RF stealth. You have to add the other things on top.
And we have to acknowledge that the work that we've done in stealth, not just for shaping, but materials, is really important. Is what's providing the advanced stealth capabilities and low observability for the B-21. Now, Gonzo, I want to bring you back and pull on the thread that a key element that General Abdul mentioned when he's describing building this strike. It's the readiness, right? There's no secret that chronic underfunding and hard use has eroded Air Force readiness across its entire aircraft inventory. So how does the Air Force go about surging specific elements of these aircraft? Because we can't lose sight of the fact that we only have 19 operational B-2s. Remember, they were prematurely terminated before the actual full program of record was acquired. And at any given moment, one or two were down for depot level maintenance. Another's probably at Edwards helping develop future capabilities as part of the modernization and test fleet. And maybe 2 or 3 are down for just sort of standard maintenance. And that means we basically had to launch the entire remaining B-2 fleet for both the aircraft headed to Iran and the decoy tails, right? So add in 5th generation and 4th generation fighters, tankers, ISR aircraft, and everything else involved with the mission. This was no small lift because all of those aircraft are also facing their mission capability challenges. So can you speak to us about how the Air Force and industry supports generating this kind of surge? It's also a risk that we're taking by not carrying higher everyday readiness levels.
Yeah, Heather, you're absolutely right. This likely required Whiteman to use all of his combat-capable B-2s, not just the birds that actually flew the missions, but they also had engine running hot spares, armed, crewed, and ready to launch, replace any aircraft that had to abort before takeoff or shortly thereafter due to equipment malfunctions.
Yeah,
now, that was exactly the case for the El Dorado Canyon strike on Libya in 1986. My brother was crewing an F-111 hot spare on a Hammerhead, ready to go in case a mission aircraft aborted. But the larger point is that the Air Force now has the smallest and oldest bomber fleet in its history, and its readiness levels are bouncing off historic lows. And that's the result of the chronic lack of spares and other capabilities due to insufficient funding. So the hard truth is the Air Force now has 141 total bombers, and maybe it can get 40 of those aircraft to engine start at any given time. Yeah, you can surge your readiness for a special mission like this by eating into war reserve materials, but those materials have been chronically underfunded as well, again, due to undersized budgets. So I'm very concerned about the readiness of the bomber force as well as our fighter inventories should they have to deploy to fight a major conflict in the Pacific or another region and conduct extended operations.
Now, Gonzo, you nailed it. Wars are won or lost based on sustaining the right mix of capabilities, the capacity, and readiness. And what they pulled off, our crews pulled off on Saturday, was a hell of a party trick. It was amazing, but it was one mission. If we were fighting a real war against China or anybody else, it is what can you do day after day? And that is what we've got to rebuild at an emergency surge level right now because it is too thin. It's dangerous.
Well, and also to bring in the notion of mass and concentration. We still have yet to really understand what the final battle damage assessment, the functionality, and the destruction levels of the nuclear sites in Iran are. But what if it was the number of B-2s and the number of munitions that was limiting the full potential of that strike? So could we have and should we have launched more if we had had them available?
No, excellent point. And I think General Kane really said it well, where he was cautious about what the bomb damage assessment was actually going to reveal. And we don't know. Are there going to be more restrikes? Those are very complex targets. I think politically, certain people were doing the high five, and certainly it was executed very well, but the BDA still's got to come in on this.
Yeah. And I mean, think also about what the cost of additional strikes might be, because now you've got to consider your diplomatic consequences, and it becomes more problematic to revisit targets because the adversary's there waiting for you. So we don't know yet what kind of support Russia and China might be sending to Iran to boost their air defense capabilities. So going back and revisiting those targets might be more difficult. And if we've depleted some core munitions inventories that we don't have enough of, there's not a hotline of we can't surge that kind of production, that becomes even more problematic. So, Gonzo, the crews begin to launch, and I take that, obviously, that begins with V-2s, and you've got refueling aircraft launching out of other bases. They're meeting up, they're testing their refueling capabilities, the air spares are going away, and others are moving forward. This was really a dramatic mission, 37 hours. Now, you've executed ultra-long-range bomber flights during your career as well, so can you help us understand what the crews faced with this kind of sortie? I mean, the U.S. is one of the few nations that can really pull this off, if not the only.
Yeah, Heather, this mission started months ago, without a doubt. The air crews involved flew a number of sorties and simulators that include multiple things, penetrating Badland country and then conducting bomb runs. That intense mission planning and rehearsal was likely supplemented by training flights. On a more personal level, bomber crews coordinate in advance of these long-duration sorties, which Things such as which pilot will fly different legs of mission, how they'll share air refueling duties, and other critical mission tasks. They even coordinate details like when they're going to take a rest break. So crew management is absolutely critical to mission success. Now, my longest sortie lasted a little over 33 hours nonstop. And I know firsthand, you have to be in great shape mentally and physically to fly 12 to 14 hours, deliver weapons on target within seconds of your planned target times, and then fly 14 hours to home base. Now, our bomber crews know that's their job, and they prepare every day for it. They know they might be tasked to deploy to war with little prior warning, and they may have to even fly their initial strike sorties from their home bases in the U.S. So that's why Global Strike Command regularly exercises its crews for those long-duration missions.
Well, there's no doubt about it. The air crew that executed these operations are real heroes, and they deserve a huge recognition and pat on the back for what they've done, not only for our national security, but also for the personal toll, readiness, heroism, and endurance that they demonstrated.
No, and those tanker guys, too. We're talking a lot about the CAF, but the MAF is pretty important here.
No one kicks ass without tanker gas, that's for sure. So, Charles, let's bring in the space equation, because as Doug mentioned, we focus a ton on the aircraft, and so have the media, but we all know that modern air power demands robust space power. So talk to us about what was in play, because the capabilities for navigation, communication, and high levels of command and control, plus I'm guessing space played a huge part in planning the mission as well.
Yeah, Heather, you're absolutely right. The planning for this mission probably started with intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance of the target sites, understanding what the pattern of behavior was there, what their locations were, et cetera. When the aircraft launched, they didn't launch blindly. I'm sure they had weather forecasts of the entire route and over the target locations. That was probably updated in real time as the mission progressed. That was all relayed probably to them via SATCOM, satellite communications. That also enabled the coordination with tankers as well as other support aircraft and the fighters to meet up. GPS, absolutely.
Huge.
Guiding the aircraft to meet at rendezvous points, to conduct missions, as well as get them over the theater and over the targets. So it is really a holistic view of a lot of space capabilities being integrated into this strike package.
And I think we don't appreciate enough how much we rely on space for the admin, like you're talking about, the weather, the data links, the SATCOM, but also the lethal effects element of that.
Yeah, the lethal effects element. And we've talked about the battle damage assessment, and certainly we've seen images from satellites of the targets to before and after, so that there's some initial battle damage assessment. I don't think that all of that BDA is going to come exclusively from imagery. There may be other phenomenology that we're looking at as well.
Yeah, space is there from well before left of launch, and I'm talking launch of the aircraft, to well post-attack.
Yep.
So as I understand it, GPS was likely jammed over Iran, and the aircraft probably needed to use alternate means to navigate. So this is probably why it's important for us. So this is going to be a major reason why it's important that we always possess multiple solution pathways to avoid single points of failure, both within the aircraft, but also within the weapons as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Heather. You talked about having multiple dilemmas for adversaries to consider, right? This is another one of those examples where we can't just put all of our eggs in the GPS basket. It has to be in a multiple approach. And we know the B-2 also has inertial navigation systems, as well as the massive ordnance penetrator. It is a GPS guided or aided munition, but it is not exclusively GPS guided, right? So they also use INS systems. I don't know what the GPS jamming environment looked like over Iran. We know that in Ukraine and in the Middle East, there is significant GPS degradation from jammers. I don't know how much Israel already took out some of those jammers potentially in their earlier strikes, but it is safe to assume that Iran possessed the GPS jammers and would have used them if they could.
And we have to assume in our planning, as well as when we design and produce requirements for aircraft systems, as well as the munitions, that we have to anticipate those capabilities.
Absolutely.
PenFed checking and savings accounts are here for all your adventures. From
do you take this man to be your husband?
I do.
To
He has your eyes. He's perfect.
learn more at PenFed.org. Federally insured by NCUA.
So John Duptula, putting your commander hat back on, walk us through what's happening in the CENTCOM kayak as the B-2s are crossing the Atlantic. How are the other force elements being integrated? We talked about the tankers and launching escort fighters. How are you working this?
Well, Heather, listening to your question, that takes me back, and my first thought is when I was the commander of the KOC for the opening stages of Operation Enduring Freedom in 2001, because the first missions that I incorporated in the plan and then launched were B-2s from Whiteman Air Force Base. And in fact, that first mission became the longest B-2 mission in history, 44 hours.
Wow.
Those B-2s came nonstop from Whiteman, but instead of going east as they did this time, they headed west, flying to Afghanistan. They delivered their payloads on multiple targets per aircraft, and then recovered on Diego Garcia, switched crews, leaving the engines running, and then returned to Whiteman. So over 70-hour missions on those airplanes with engines running. And by the way, I got a bunch of stories about that I'll, in interest of time, I'll save, but maybe I'll share with you after this. Now, back to this Saturday's mission. The KOC is generally where the master attack plan is designed, organized, assembled, and then translated into an air tasking order, and then disseminated to units participating. The individual unit commanders are then responsible for assuring their mission elements are launched and arrive in the right place at the right time. The KOC commander is mainly monitoring the plan that's already in play and only gets involved if there's an operational level decision that needs to be made due to some sort of anomaly in the mission or new information. Again, thinking back to early Enduring Freedom days, there are critical targets that sometimes pop up that require a orchestration of changing assets and redirecting strikes that were already in the plan. In this case, it was a pretty set plan. All the players understood where they needed to be, when they needed to be there, and it proceeded exactly as it was planned.
I think that's great because what you're speaking to is really that notion of centralized command, but decentralized execution, where you're trusting your mission commanders to go do the JOB.
Right.
And you're not doing that micromanagement, that 1,000-mile screwdriver that many of us personally experienced during the later stages of OAF and OEF.
Well, that's right. Micromanagement is a disease. Unfortunately, modern telecommunications have provided operational and strategic leaders to be able to reach down into your cockpit, and that needs to be avoided.
And also in terms of risk, right? That allowed us or enabled us to become more risk averse as opposed to trusting that our aircrew and our mission commanders had the maturity and professionalism to assess risk on their own based off of what the commander's intent was.
Yep. Again, this is another one we could talk about a long time, but we've got to unlearn a lot of bad lessons that were learned during operations in Afghanistan and Iraq.
So let's talk about the submarine that launched the Tomahawk cruise missiles, because coordinating that crew to ensure synchronized timing of effects is really important. Who is in charge of that? Is that the JFAC? Is it the maritime commander? Because as I recall, you use Tomahawks in Desert Storm, so you've got experience on that front as well. Yeah,
and you're spot on. Look, there are always doctrinal fights over command relationships. But the fact of the matter, the CJFAC, all right, that stands for Combined and Joint Force Air Component Commander, is the one who should have control over that function. And in the case of Desert Storm, we did. I'm the one that planned the timing of and the targets for those cruise missiles. And that's all inherent in the planning function. It's not about what's written, what service or nation is written on the side of the airplane, on the side of the ATACMs, on the side of the cruise missiles. It's all about integrated planning on what's necessary to achieve the desired effects or outcomes of a particular mission. So, it is the JFAC's function, his or her organization's function, to determine how the times on target are established based on how and why those cruise missiles are being used in the first place. So all that coordination occurs well in advance of execution, and actual implementation is then delegated to the subs doing the launch.
So Houston, let's bring you in here, because not only do you have a ton of experience as a fighter pilot, but you also commanded nearly every one of the Air Force's unmanned airborne ISR assets during the course of your career. How did they integrate into these kinds of operations? And what would they be doing to gather intel prior to the raid? Or are they doing more BDA post-battle damage assessment?
Yeah, Heather, I'll make a couple points on this. Number one, the boss did a great job highlighting how critical intel in general is going to be to the overall success of this mission. Mm-hmm. Charles did a fantastic job going over the role space does in terms of gathering a lot of that intelligence. But sometimes space is going to be insufficient. There's going to be seams, and you need the aircraft that are going to be able to collect that intelligence to make the mission success or fail. And so many folks are going to say, and the boss has talked about how important stealth is. And so MQ-9's not going to be important for this kind of mission. But I want to highlight that before a mission like this occurs, there's going to be months, if not years, of preparation of the battle space. And no asset has proved more capable of collecting important intelligence to determine what the enemy is doing, what their intentions are, patterns of life, than the MQ-9. But every now and then, like we saw over the weekend, you have to penetrate the IADs, you have to go downtown and penetrate the threat. The MQ-9 is not going to allow you to do that. That's why we have aircraft like the RQ-170. And that aircraft is going to be able to go either ahead or behind the package and be able to collect the intelligence that space may not be able to collect and penetrate using its stealth characteristics and get that BDA. Now, I want to point out that in this case, as Charles also said, BDA on a deep buried target is going to be difficult no matter what kind of air or space asset you've got.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you mentioned both the MQ-9 and the RQ-170 because the MQ-9 has been the workhorse. And as we look towards the future, even though folks might think, oh, well, that's an old asset, there are so many mission opportunities where that aircraft and others similar to it, so follow-on versions, will be absolutely critical because of the persistence, the flexibility, the payload that it has for, not just something like this, but, for example, the Arctic, Northern Tier defense, space defense, and other opportunities. But that penetrating capability, when you mix that with space, really layers a really great intelligence because of the airborne capabilities to be flexible, to move around, to go to the point of need in ways that space doesn't always have that flexibility to do. As we're following the mission thread, let's say the B-2s are getting near Iran. Defense leaders have explained that they were joined by 4th and 5th generation fighters. So, sir, you've commanded these strikes before. Why are fighters important?
Well, it's a great question.
Conversation.
I'm sorry?
I can't believe we're having this conversation. Why are fighters important? But go ahead.
Yeah, well, I'll just answer the question.
Just
We'll talk about why later. First, air superiority is fundamental to any successful mission. And what I tell you is the Israeli air campaign over the last week, 9 days, offers a powerful reminder of the advantage of achieving air superiority in securing campaign success and providing strategic alternatives and options. Israel can now operate over Iran with little, if any, interference by Iran. The side that dominates the air dictates the terms of the battle. This is a lesson that every military and defense strategist must internalize. Air superiority is not an optional condition in modern war. It's the foundation upon which victory is built. So back to this specific mission. While the B-2 is highly stealthy, reducing risk to the mission success means we needed to do everything possible to suppress any potential threat. Now here's where F-22s add value well beyond their air superiority roles. They are able to fly undetected into hostile airspace and act as electronic warfare-enabled, sensor-rich, multi-role aircraft. My point here is they can do a lot more than just shoot down other airplanes if they need to. Escorting the B-2s into and out of the target area while gathering details about the enemy systems and then spreading intelligence to the other networked aircraft that were supporting this mission was critical to providing overall situation awareness for the entire mission. So that, along with, there are other airplanes that were involved in this that provided suppression of enemy air defense capabilities that were also integrated, are all elements that basically get to the answer to your question, why fighters are important.
So there's a key point where one of your taglines you always talk about, it's not just an F-22 or an F-35, it's an F-E-A-R-C. The list goes on.
F-E-A-R-C, E-W-A-W-A-C-S, 22s and 35s.
And so you think about what Israel had been bringing in with those F-35s for many, many days, and then we bring in another tranche of it. and the number of mission effects that were secured there, especially on the information dominance and the electronic warfare spectrum of it, nothing else could have done that. And yet those are vital to bring in over the target area, or we wouldn't have been able to do this.
Yeah, you have to be able to layer those effects. And you also need to have enough aircraft to be able to position those effects where they are effective, whether or not that's a particular axis or range of formation, or targeting other elements that Iran may have had in its air defense systems, whether or not those are aircraft, radars, missiles, and so forth. So there's a element where the numbers matter, the maneuverability matters, in addition to the range and the payload. We cannot forget that geography and mission and threat will define the requirements of the particular aircraft's performance and aerodynamic capabilities. It's not just all about the sensors. Those have to be there. We have to have those information capabilities. We have to have the payload. We have to have the range, but we also need to have the maneuverability and the force size to achieve the right layered effects. Joan Deptula, I think you probably have some thoughts on this, given that there are a few pundits who have written about the need to move beyond air superiority and embrace a more defensive-minded thinking, since their proposed air littoral is so congested with small drones. And these ideas are coming out from folks with no major theater warfighting experience, and they're watching the Ukraine fight. They're learning the wrong lessons.
Yeah, well, Heather, the short answer is these are curious novelty propositions that have found absolutely no acceptance by Air Force leaders, and it's clear to see why. Victory can never be attained by just focusing on defense. You don't win a football game by only playing defense, and wars don't work that way either.
Amen.
You know, the air littoral is a cute name for low-altitude airspace. Those who understand Air Force history know that low-altitude operations have always been challenging, and today, even more so, with the proliferation of portable precision-guided munitions in the form of small drones. But changing the name of low-altitude airspace adds no value, nor does it provide any solution for the procedures that are already established for deconflicting this airspace. So, look, today, Israel prevails over Iran with air superiority, and that's key to achieving their objectives. None of the superficial propositions that have curiously emerged have any relevance to the reality of the very effective air campaign that Israel has imposed over Iran.
Where Houston, talked to us about the notion of offensive counter-air and defensive counter-air.
Yeah, Heather, absolutely critical to mission success today. And it goes right to what the boss was talking about with air superiority. Without the offensive counter-air and the defensive counter-air, the mission does not succeed. One day we will find out what exactly was the Israeli Air Force able to accomplish leading up to this. And I think that's a critical part of this overall mission success. But General Kane spoke about harm missiles coming off rails and striking targets on the ground. The only aircraft in the U.S. Air Force inventory that carries that is the F-16 CJ.
Yeah.
And so the F-16s, yet again, played a key role in executing this mission and performing mission success.
So really incredible offensive counter-air and defensive counter-air, not just in terms of U.S. operations, but as you mentioned, the Israeli operations, in order to be able to enable fourth-generation fighters to be able to execute their mission sets within that battle space. And I think it also goes to show that for now, fourth-generation aircraft can still have relevance in these contested environments based off of the support and the layered effects that we provide them. A lot of folks think that fighters are all about white scarf operations, but what's crucial is also going after the threats on the ground, the surface-to-air missile threats, the radar sites, the command and control sites, to be able to blind and paralyze the adversary to prevent them from being able to launch those counter-air operations.
Yeah, air superiority is a lot more than dogfighting.
It is.
Absolutely.
It is. Coming from our space guy. Thank you, Charles. So, Gonzo, this all brings up a really key point. We executed this raid after Israel's Air Force, and a huge shout out to the F-35, as we said before, after what they gained what appears to be air superiority over Iran. So from a bomber perspective, can you talk to us about why this is so crucial, both for the U.S. to project power, but also to limit Iran's retaliatory options?
Absolutely. So B-2s are getting the headlines of the strike, and as a bomber guy, I'll say rightly so. But it really is a team effort. It's a combination of fifth gen and, in the future, sixth gen fighters and bombers that are going to reduce risk for our air crews and guarantee mission success. So looking to the future, the Air Force's F-47 NGAD fighter and the B-21, they're going to be an unbeatable combination. And they are two parts of the long-range strike family systems the Air Force envisioned some 15 years ago. They're going to be able to go anywhere to deny operational sanctuaries to peer adversaries. And that brings us to the other point you mentioned. A warfighting strategy of denial is now envisioned by some in the Pentagon will not be enough to defeat Chinese aggression in the future. It's very high risk to assume that we'll be able to defend Taiwan by fighting on China's periphery, because that would give the PLA sanctuaries within China's defended interior to generate massive missile attacks against our forces and our bases throughout the Pacific. So we must have the capability and the capacity to take the fight to PLA, deny them sanctuaries, and suppress the tempo of their long-range attacks. If we don't, we're going to lose our ability to generate enough combat sorties to succeed. We'll lose our aircraft and our airmen on the ground. And that's why we need the F-47 and B-21 to deny sanctuaries to PLA. That's what Israel has achieved against Iran. It's not some airman's theory. It's a reality. And we can see proof of that reality as the size and frequency of Iran's missile attacks against Israel diminish because of what its forces have done.
Gons, I'm glad you mentioned that last point. The Wall Street Journal published a really interesting chart looking at how many missiles Iran is firing into Israel. And you can really see the drop off. And it begins exactly when the offensive air campaign begins. It's because they're going after the Archers and the stores of the missiles. And when we are terrified about missile barrages coming after us in the Pacific and taking out our bases and all of that, we cannot just be there with the catcher's mitt. We have got to go after the source of those missiles. That is the only way we're going to be able to effectively fight and stay in theater. And we got to get used to that and play to win.
So, Slider, another part of the survival equation is electronic warfare and cyber effects. And we've talked about this before in this conversation, as well as other podcasts. But I know that you're a big fan of these capabilities. What would you like to add to the conversation there?
Yeah, I'll say cyber is a proven actor in this area. For those of you who have not read about Stuxnet, I encourage you to go read about that, where an entity actually used cyber to target these centrifuges. And it's hard to believe that story is almost 20 years old.
Yeah.
But you know behind the scenes there were other cyber actors going on to enable this overall mission. Because sometimes cyber is not enough. You got to get in there with kinetics, and that's what was proven over the weekend. Second, I want to say that when it comes to cyber and it comes to electronic warfare, that all goes back to the boss's principle of air superiority. And always in the 21st century, going along with air superiority is always going to be electromagnetic superiority. Those two are always going to go hand in hand. And what allowed that were our fifth generation fighters who are able to present both the stealth characteristics to degrade the EM spectrum of the enemy, as well as to do their own EM spectrum effects while they're ingressing the target.
Yeah, so the self-protection is really important. And we've provided that self-protection on fourth generation fighters as well. And continuing to invest in those capabilities is key to be able to maintain the mass, because right now we don't have the foresight to go fifth gen only. We've got to have all of those players. And electronic warfare and electronic attack is a key element to that across all of our platforms.
Exactly. We have to keep investing in systems like the F-15s, EPAWs, and other systems.
And iView for F-16. Exactly. Okay, so let's get back to the mission, right? So B-2s and their fighter escorts have departed the targets. Slider and Charles, how does that BDA work? Because I'm guessing we have both space and air options. We've alluded a little bit that it's not one or the other. It's probably, we need more than just both of those as well.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about this earlier, but it starts with understanding what the condition of those targets were before the strike so that you have something to compare against. I'm sure there was probably some eyeballs on targets as bombs went off, and there may have been some initial reaction there. But then satellite imagery, as well as other phenomenology from space and other domains to monitor those sites to see what activity is continuing or not continuing, any signs of radiation, which apparently there have been no signs of any radiation leaks at these nuclear sites, so that was excellent. But all of that plays in. It's going to take a long time to figure out exactly what the impacts of these strikes were to determine a full set of the battle damage assessment.
And I think using both air and space assets to get the multispectral picture of what happened. We always go straight to the pictures. What is the picture? Because we're very familiar with pictures, but there's always the multispectral, and it is amazing what our intel experts can come up with when they review those multispectral images.
As well as pattern of life. So the persistence that space and air can provide to show us that pattern of life, because that gives us an insight into how Iran is responding to the damage. We can do some inference there regarding what the damage actually is, gain some more intelligence there. So, Doug, what's your take on the aftermath, both here in D.C. and the world at large? How are other nations and bodies responding to this?
Well, first and foremost, I think it's important that we look at this, and that's what we've tried to do in the episode, in a very impartial, strategic view, and it was a very successful mission. We think the requirement existed to do it. I listened to the Sunday news talk shows on purpose as a barometer, just to gauge where the environment was on both sides. And boy, you can tell we live in a hyper polarized political environment, because if you listen to the Republicans, this was more complex than D-Day, and this was the most amazing thing that has ever happened on the planet ever. And if you listen to the Democrats, this was really inappropriate, and they're almost apologizing for Iran, and they are just hammering this war powers thing and congressional notification, and they kind of forget. I looked at it last night out of curiosity. Yeah, congressional notification didn't go out when we killed Osama bin Laden. Things like OPSEC do matter, and given the level of complexity on this and the lives at risk, I don't fault the administration for just going to execute. This is a problem that has extended past any given political party, any administration. And that's my real frustration here on the instant polarization take on this, because multiple administrations going back multiple decades have been really, really challenged what to do here. And like the boss said, Iran has done nothing but talk and take, and their direction was unilateral. It was clear. And somebody had to do something at a given point in time. I think when I look at where we sit in a little bit closer term, given we're in the middle of the budget cycle and all, what terrifies me is that everything that made this mission successful is currently at risk. Charles has done an amazing job talking about the Space Force and what the Guardians brought to this fight. They've not gotten enough recognition on it. The Space Force is taking a cut in the core budget this year. This is insane. Yeah, they're getting some stuff in reconciliation, and that's great, but it's not a guaranteed passage that reconciliation gets through. But we're actually cutting space in the core budget? This is nuts. If you look at the 5th gen, we have hammered this so hard, how important it is. It has absolutely made this campaign. We have cut the F-35 buy to its smallest number ever when we've been in the full-scale zone. This is insane. Heather, you've done the report talking about fighter squadrons falling off cliffs. I mean, the Guard units are shuddering right now because we don't have enough fighters coming online to backfill Cold War aircraft that have to be retired because they're physically exhausted. Kadena, active duty, key location, one of the most important fighter bases in the world, has not had permanently assigned fighter aircraft in multiple years because we're not buying them fast enough. This is insane. B-21, we cannot accelerate that buy fast enough, and we've got to buy more of them faster, because 19 B-2s is not enough to sustain an actual campaign. Like I said earlier, this is a hell of a party trick. Very impressive, but it's not a sustainable operation. And then, I go across the board. We're not buying E-7 when we talk about the need for multiple domain pathways to help make an enemy's calculus harder. And then just back to readiness. We are way too low. We got to buy our way out of it. I can only imagine the Herculean efforts that the airmen at Whiteman and the Northrop Grumman folks and everybody did to get those B-2s on step. And that had to be a major miracle, not a minor miracle, a major miracle to get them on that step. I don't think that many have been operationally airborne ever. And they're over 30 years old. Half the vendors that made that thing aren't in business anymore. This is problematic. So again, every single thing that people are high-fiving themselves over right now, saying this is great, go America, rah-rah, guess what? Everything that underpins it, we are underinvesting in or actively cutting right now. This is insane. And continuing resolutions don't help either, Congress.
And you didn't even talk about the EA-37B or our munitions inventory.
Yeah.
Right? So there are so many things right now that are being cut, sliced in half, at risk in future budgets and in this budget. So thank you for that.
Yeah, can't agree more on the need to grow, especially the Space Force budget. So thanks for that shout out, Doug. I do want to circle back on something said about the hyper-polarized world that we currently live in. I saw a lot of the protests going around the country as well as around the world. And what struck me, because I looked up, hey, there's a lot of printed signs. Who made those? A lot of them were socialist and communist parties here in the United States, right? So, of course, they're going to have that particular slant, and anything that the government does is going to be inherently wrong in their view. I am 100% in favor of freedom of speech. I think we should protest when we think we have something to protest about. Absolutely. That's why it's the First Amendment. But before you get out there in the street and start carrying signs, find out who printed those signs and why they printed them. They may not be supporting the cause that you think they are.
That's a really good point. General Deptula, same question to you.
First, I want to reemphasize what some people have already implied or said, and that's that U.S. air attacks yesterday deserve an A+ in terms of performance. It was a spectacular demonstration of an extraordinarily well-done set of air and space operations. This was a very difficult mission to plan and execute, and one that our very best pilots, weapons officers, and targeteers executed flawlessly. Like most air operations that are successful, they made it look easy, but it was actually very, very complex and dangerous. Now, we're talking about using over 125 aircraft. The B-2s flying over 7,000 miles one way, entering highly defended airspace, executing the first operational delivery of the GBU-57 that needed exquisite precision, requiring exact synchronization with the other U.S. combat aircraft to assure tightly timed suppression of enemy air defenses, all done with minimal communications, and then flying 7,000 miles back in the air 37 hours. So this mission confirmed the unmatched capabilities of the U.S. military, and particularly the Air Force. Now, what's not so evident in this magnificent air combat performance that you and Doug and others have alluded to is that if we had to do this again today, or for a sustained period of time, we couldn't. The U.S. Air Force today is the oldest, the smallest, and the least ready in its history. As Gonzo mentioned earlier, it only has 19 B-2s and they're over 30 years old. The B-52, which Gonzo flew, and which consists of our largest bomber force, just celebrated its 73rd birthday of its first flight. And what we saw on Saturday was, as Doug pointed out, about the maximum operational B-2 force that could be generated for a one-day attack. And there's the other part. We expended about half of the GBU-57 weapons inventory. So the Air Force is in a force structure and weapons inventory crisis, and it needs attention to be rebuilt if America wants to retain and grow this capability and capacity to perform more than a one-and-done mission.
Sir, thank you. So what are thoughts from everyone else? President Trump ran on the slogan, peace through strength, and we saw that strength on Saturday, but I think we've made it clear that our bench is very, very thin. From a human capital perspective to capabilities to the actual Air Force inventory and readiness. I'd like to hear from the rest of you.
Yeah, there's different types of strength, right? There's the immediate exertion force, but then there's the endurance that has to go along with that. And we need both. That endurance isn't just a matter of munitions and depth, it's also about national will and making sure that the United States and the members of Congress that are working with you are in agreement on the direction that the country's headed in. And so there has to be an element of diplomacy associated with this military action. And I think we're seeing that unfold as we're moving out today.
You know, Charles, I'm really glad you mentioned the national will, because this gets back to what Doug said, where the immediate response on Congress was to run to partisanship and really that sort of polarization for their own political party's advantage, as opposed to understanding that as a nation, all of us, we have core strategic interests, and that has to be bigger and more important than our own party's influence.
Absolutely. I have never seen a political party or a political leader make 100% of the right decisions, in my opinion, right? There's always room for debate and discussion. But what's important is, what are the core values of this country? What is the Constitution? And we all in the military took an oath to support the Constitution, right? That's the important
and what are our national interests? And taking out Iran's nuclear capabilities is in our national interest, and that is more important than the political maneuvering. And we have to remember that, because coming together at that level is what provides that national will to be able to endure and, frankly, deter continued aggression across the United States.
Yeah. As we said earlier in the podcast, Iran's been a threat for over 45 years. To regional stability as well as global stability. A nuclear-armed Iran is certainly not something we want to consider.
Recognizing that we have strategic interests and national interests that rise above our political parties is really core to being able to deter aggression across a global stage and being able to endure and persist when we do have to take action.
Heather, you mentioned peace through strength. Now, that's the patch I wore on my shoulder for a couple of decades in Strategic Air Command. Today's bomber force is a third the size of our Cold War bomber force. And we were deterring a single peer adversary, the Soviet Union, back then. And now we have two, China as well. And that force is a result of serial cuts over the last 30 years that were driven by insufficient Air Force budgets. But it's also important to remember the Air Force kept pace with the Soviet Union's development of new air defense technologies and did so throughout the Cold War by continuously modernizing its bomber force to maintain its ability to penetrate, to strike any target with conventional nuclear weapons. That modernization cycle came to a screeching halt in the 1990s. And so we're now playing catch up in our bomber force and many of our other military technologies with China. So that's another reason why our Air Force, our nation, needs at least 200 B-21s. Multiple studies have supported that number, and maybe the same number of F-47s, because together they're going to anchor our long-range strike family systems to deter and, if necessary, defeat America's adversaries.
Come on, Slider. I know you got something.
Okay, Heather, I want to point out current Air Force Air Combat Commander General Wilsbach is frequent to say the most difficult and important thing that we do is fly and fix aircraft. And right now, we are short thousands of aircraft maintainers, and we have a pilot shortage that has been going on for years now.
Yeah.
You've written papers about it. And we've got to get serious about getting those professional maintainers back in our ranks. And we've got to retain those pilots, because missions like today do not go on, do not succeed without that talent and that professionalism. And certainly we cannot sustain this type of operation without those professional airmen.
What I'm hearing from everyone is that we've got to modernize and recapitalize to capabilities that are relevant to today for the future. We have to have the strategic depth, so we have to have the force size to be able to persist in an enduring conflict, not just a one and done. And we have to have the human capital, the expertise, the people across all of our supporting all those capabilities, whether or not it's the pilots and the air crew, the maintainers, the battle managers, and we've got to be able. And all this requires dollars, so we've got to resource. It was a fantastic operation. I mean, truly spectacular what those air crew did across the entire force package. But we have to resource our airmen. That's a moral obligation to give them the force that they need to succeed and do what our nation asks. Gentlemen, thank you for being here today.
Hey, great session, Heather. See ya.
Gonzo?
Thank you, Heather.
Thanks, Heather. Great conversation.
Thanks, Heather.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
And with that, I'd like to extend a big thank you to our guests for joining in today's conversation. I'd also like to extend a big thank you to you, our listeners, for your continued support and for tuning into today's show. If you like what you heard today, don't forget to hit that like button or follow or subscribe to the Aerospace Advantage. You can also leave a comment to let us know what you think about our show or areas that you would like us to explore further. As always, you can join in on the conversation by following the Mitchell Institute on X, Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn, and you can always find us at mitchellaerospacepower.org. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great aerospace power kind of day. See you next time.